The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm truly honored to be speaking with all of you today, and thank you for inviting me for this event. The topic today on religion and politics is an extremely important topic. You can say that it is one of the fundamentals of the success of Singapore. So Dr. Edwin Tay, Reverend Ezekiel Tan, my fellow panelists, Mark Chan, Dr. Chung, and of course, Eugene. I am happy that you all shared your views, and I will set out my views. I want to keep my own remarks very short, maybe 15 minutes, and I'll prefer to give more time for Q&A. Yeah. I will share three aspects with you on religion and politics in Singapore. First, we take a secular approach to policy making. What does that mean? First, our policies are fair to all, and aimed at benefiting all Singaporeans. No particular religion is given favorable treatment. Second, we guarantee freedom of religion. Every person has a right to practice his or her religious beliefs, does not matter who you are. I should have said no particular religion being given favorable treatment is the second point. Then we also work with different religious groups. Secularity does not mean that the government keeps away from religion or that the government adopts a hands-off approach. We actively reach out, build ties with different religious groups, and lots of work has been done on this. In a multi-religious society like ours, it is important that the government and the different religious groups have strong ties and have good relationships, so that when issues arise in community between religious groups, or when laws are passed which affect religious groups, we are able to reach out to the different leaders, explain the position, interact, keep an open channel, make it clear that our common aims are similar. Our aims are common and similar. And one recent example is, Home Affairs. When we reviewed the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, we engaged all the religious groups very extensively. And in June of 2019, with the support of the government, our religious leaders worked together on a document called the Commitment to Safeguard Religious Harmony. And today, more than 680 organizations and 73 community groups have affirmed this commitment, which is a commitment by the major religious groups on the principles of religious harmony. The fact that more than 680 religious organizations, including major religious organizations, have affirmed the commitment is to be celebrated. It won't happen in many countries. That approach has underpinned the religious harmony that we have. The government has to be in a position, it's got to be trusted enough to be able to persuade all groups to come together for the common good and to maintain religious and racial harmony and maintain a unified and common space. And that requires constant effort on all sides. crucial that we continue to deepen the understanding, build trust so that we can handle sensitive issues effectively. And the third aspect that I want to talk about is restricting hate and offensive speech. I spoke at length on this in Parliament in April 2019. What is hate speech? It's defined as all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify religious hatred, racial hatred, or other forms of hatred based on intolerance. Hate speech, which denigrates and dehumanizes the out-group, as it were, and suggests that the out-group is the source of problems and paints the out-group as subhuman. One of the most famous examples, of course, is during the Holocaust in Germany. White power music by white racialists to deny humanity of African Americans in the US has been common. Different countries take different approaches to dealing with hate speech. If you are in the US, speech is prohibited only if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action. And the speech is likely to incite or produce such action. So it's a very high threshold. So you get a lot of speech that's anti-Semitic, that denigrates African Americans and others, and even hate speech from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And all of that is allowed. If you move to Europe, France, for example, they have the concept of laicite, freedom of expression. Laicite is the idea of secularity. Now, what that means is the state doesn't intervene, and it allows, and freedom of speech means that any publication can publish a religiously offensive material like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, which, by the way, are not only targeted at Muslims. There are also many cartoons that are targeted at the Pope, the nuns, the Christians, every religion. And they are not specifically focused on any one religion. It would have the Pope masturbating, nuns doing, all sorts of things which are indecent. Cartoons. Their society is able to accept it. We take a different view and we will say no to these things. So we recognize that religion is an emotive issue. Some of you may remember about 5-6 years ago, a 17-year-old student made inflammatory posts on his blogs. And one of the posts was titled The Second Holocaust. And he advocated the extermination of Muslims and Malays. He was charged, pleaded guilty. He expressed remorse for his actions. The blogs were taken down. The court sentenced him to 2 years of probation, not jail, but probation. And he was required to perform 180 hours of community service with a Malay welfare organization, which in my view is probably the best way to deal with these things, depending on the facts. And he was also required to attend counseling sessions with a qualified therapist. So we don't tolerate hate speech in Singapore. We protect everyone, majority or minority, and from hate speech, threats, and violence. That is our approach to hate speech, which I think is relatively uncontroversial. So if we move one step lower, what about offensive speech? Sometimes there's no bright and clear line between hate speech and offensive speech. What happens if we allow offensive speech to enter mainstream discourse? Let me give some examples. There's a famous ventriloquist, Jeff Dunham, in the US. One of his more popular acts, he works with puppets. It's Ahmed, the dead terrorist. So you can imagine. He peddles in offensive views of various races and religions, Dunham. He performs to sell out crowds in America and is one of the highest paid comedians in the world. His audience are mainly white Americans. But ask yourself if such expressions about Muslims or Christians or Hindus or Buddhists or atheists become common in public discourse, what happens? It's quite easy to work out. The tone and texture of public discourse will change. Giving offense to others will become normalized. And in the long run, that will only exacerbate the fault lines, create tension, jeopardize social harmony. If you look at another example, this slide, this is a US pastor, Terry Jones. He, in the name of freedom of speech, was burning the Quran. We will not allow this in Singapore. You burn the Quran or the Bible or any holy book, you will be arrested and charged. On the other hand, around in our region, if you see what's happening in Indonesia, there are prominent radical preachers whose preachings are on the YouTube. They talk about the infidel genie in the crucifix. The Shahs are danger to Muslims, a poison that has entered many Muslim hearts. Ahmadiyya is a rape of Islamic teaching and should be dissolved. So Christians, Ahmadiyya, Shahs, and very inflammatory language. And when you use such language, you can imagine what happens when you use religion in this way. So we have seen what happens in other societies. So in Singapore, we take action against both hate speech and offensive speech. And we do not allow any race or religion to be attacked or insulted by anyone else. So the same rules for all. So for us, the free speech stops at the boundary of giving offense to others. You can say good things about your own religion, but you certainly cannot denigrate or give offense to other religions. So those are the 3 points I wanted to share today on religion and politics today. I've rushed through a little bit because I think I looked at your program. You started at 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't think you really want long speeches, but I've made several speeches both in and out of Parliament on this topic. And it's a very, very important topic for us because many of us are religious. And, it will be absurd to suggest that we will not be informed by our faith when we analyze issues or assess opinions. But it's very important for policymakers, whether ministers or civil servants, to leave the religious skin out and always bear in mind that you are making decisions for the whole of society, for the majority, and the policies must benefit the majority of society. So that is extremely important. And that is the approach we take. And we support religions. We support religious practices in the sense that we give a framework, a strong framework for freedom of religion, and we prevent attacks of one religion on another or on any religion by people who may not be of a religious persuasion. And our approach thus far has worked, and we work closely with religious leaders, as I said. If you look at the 2019 Gallup World Poll, 95% of respondents in Singapore found the country to be a good place for racial and ethnic minorities to live in. The global average is 70%. And in Singapore, it's completely normal for, let's say, the minister for MCCY, who is a practicing Roman Catholic, to participate in a Hindu festival, Thaipusam festival, as a guest of honor. At the same time, people see that we act and we take fairly strict and decisive actions when people cross over the line and threaten violence. In the last few weeks, and you would have read, a 16-year-old boy was detained for planning attacks on a mosque, and a 20-year-old was detained for planning attacks on a synagogue. And you saw Christian leaders going to the affected mosque to meet Muslim leaders. You saw Muslim leaders going to the affected synagogue to meet with Jewish leaders. They reaffirmed the mutual trust and strong relationship that exists across religious boundaries and condemned the hatred and violence. You don't see much of this happening in many other places. But we cannot and should not take this religious harmony and understanding for granted. This has been built up over many years. Religious leaders, government working together to maintain a unified common space and safeguard our societal harmony. So our assurances are government will be fair to everyone, guarantee freedom of religion, protect everyone from hate and offensive speech, and continue to work with all religious and non-religious groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your address to us. Right now we have this opportunity for time of interaction with the Minister. Maybe as the moderator, while the questions are coming in, let me use or maybe abuse my position to ask maybe the first question of the minister. Minister, just now in your address, you mentioned that when making public policy, you expect government servants to not to see things maybe through the religious lens, but through a secular lens. I think you said a similar statement in Parliament recently in response to Mr. Pritam Singh's question. My question is, I wonder whether there's a connotation here to the effect that for someone to see things through their religious lens is necessarily a bad thing, that it might lead to parochialism or bias towards your own community. At least for the Christian faith, I think there are strands within the faith that would insist on, universal good, human rights based on people created in God's image and so on, that propel you to be fair and impartial from a religious perspective. I wonder whether is religious perspective necessarily a negative thing? Can it also be an impetus for good? And is it realistic in the first place to demand that someone strip himself of such a fundamental perspective, which may have propelled him or her into public service in the first place? I think I'd like to hear your views on these questions.
Okay, I understand, and it's not an easy question, but it goes to the heart of the matter. Let me put it this way. How can any sensible person say that a religious perspective is negative? I mean, okay, that's my perspective anyway, that it cannot be negative. But I say that perhaps because I'm religious. I would think that, if you look at the teachings of most religions, what do they teach? They teach kindness, love, service, selfless service, the spirit of humanity, helping others. And you see so many charities that have been started, which are funded, worked on, volunteers giving their time because they believe that their religion requires them to do it. And as a result, a great amount of good has been done. I mean, look at Singapore in the early years. Who set up some of our best schools? Generation after generation of students reached their potential because of the schools that have been set up, largely by Christian missionaries. So religion can be a power for tremendous good. So, that I think I accept, I think most people, I hope, will accept. The question is, let's ask as a minister, you are there, or as a senior civil servant, permanent secretary or something, you are there. You are deciding on policies that affect society. As I said, it's not possible for you to be devoid of any feelings. You will be informed, and your worldview will be informed by, if you are religious, by your religious perspective too. But when you actually make a decision, when you analyze and assess what you need to do, you need to bear in mind, maybe this is a better way of putting it, that you need to bear in mind that you need to be very neutral. You need to think of society as comprising people of different faiths and people of no faith, and they're all Singaporeans. They're all entitled to the benefit of your policies. So your policies must take a lens of neutrality. And that is extremely important, both in terms of maintaining confidence with our people, so that people don't think, oh, you put on your own religious lens, and therefore your policies are going to be influenced by favoring that particular lens. In public policy, it's extremely important that people understand what it is that motivates you and that you have their interests at heart. Mr. Singh did ask me, he asked me, and he said, possible religious bias of top civil servants. So supposing it's common for civil servants and ministers to act with and make it clear that they're acting because of their religious inclinations, then his question will have a lot of sting, because he's basically saying, such people, I mean, his question was, stop civil servants when they make policies, laws and policies. Would there be religious bias, and would it favor particular religious beliefs? That is the sting. Not that you are informed by your religion, but that your policies are going to favor one religion over another. And I pointed out that that does a lot of disservice to our senior civil servants, public service. And while he didn't mention ministers, if such a suggestion was made, it will be a serious disservice to ministers too, because we look at Singaporeans as Singaporeans. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your religion is, whether it's our housing policy or whether it's our tax policy or education policy. It is meant for Singaporeans without favoring Christians or Muslims or Hindus or any other religion. And that's what we are trying to put across. So people must believe that the government is secular in its public policy making. If people don't believe that, and in essence, while he didn't mention it, a lot of people would have gone away thinking of Mr. Singh's question, which, if you look at the senior civil servants, what is likely to be their religion mostly in majority? And therefore, would people of that religion be favored? I mean, that's the essence of the question. And if people start believing it, the non-Christians will start getting very upset, because they will think that they are no longer then in the power group. And that's not how our civil service works. And I had to make that very clear.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that clarification. Thank you. Minister, there's a question from one of the church leaders in Singapore, asking in particular about the situation in Myanmar, the violence that we see there. Do you think it is right or okay for churches or pastors to make comments on that situation in that foreign country to our congregations in this present time? I think he's maybe looking for some direction from you.
You mean from churches in Singapore, religious institutions, organizations in Singapore, making comments on the situation in Myanmar? Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yes.
I don't think there is a problem or there would be an issue in making statements from a humanitarian perspective. In terms of, if you see violence, if you see people dying as one human being towards another, and it doesn't matter what religion they are, what race they are, what nationality they are, if people are dying and you see violence, I think we are all entitled. We don't have to be religious organizations. We are all entitled to make our views known. In those in public service, ministers and civil servants, of course, will have to be much more circumspect and careful, because there are also country-to-country relationships. And as a minister, every time I speak, it shouldn't just be what I feel about a certain situation. I've got to ask myself, is this in Singapore's best interest as a country? So I'm a little bit more constrained, but religious organizations, I think, are entitled to express their view in civil terms about what is happening. And if they feel that something wrong is happening, they're entitled to say so. We also say to our religious organizations and others that they should be careful about going into the political sphere too much, whether in Singapore or elsewhere, overseas or in Singapore, because there is a religious denomination and there is a political denomination. But sometimes they cross over. When you see people dying, I think you are entitled to call for a peace. You are entitled to call for end to the violence. You are entitled to say it is wrong to kill people. I think those are things that can be said.
Thank you, Minister. So, Minister, I think it's a matter of time before we come to this issue of sexuality, which questions have been posed by some of the participants.
Right.
I think, of course, one of the key issues in the Christian community is the push by some sectors of our society to redefine marriage, to redefine what a family is, maybe for pushing for same-sex marriage or adoption of children by same-sex couples. And of course, from one's perspective, I think we see them winning victories in different countries around the world over time. Minister, maybe you could comment on where do you see Singapore heading on this issue, and how can we deal with the new fault lines that are being developed, maybe between the different sectors of society over such issues?
There are a number of different aspects to what you have said. I think I will talk about how I think we ought to approach these things. And secondly, I will also deal with some degree of the forces that are shaping these ideas and driving these ideas. In terms of how we should approach, my own view is we should approach this with gentleness, acceptance, tolerance, love, and kindness. What does that mean? I have said many times that if you ask me personally, what people do in the privacy of their bedroom is really none of the government's concern, as long as it's not criminal and as long as children are not involved. A separate point is, what should our laws be? And I've said our laws ought to reflect the social mores of our society. So at this stage, we have Section 377A. The government has said, consistent with what I just said, what people do in the privacy of their bedroom is none of my concern. The government has said we do not actively prosecute male homosexuality. Female homosexuality is not an offense in the books. Male homosexuality it's a colonial law, but we have said we will not actively prosecute. So that tells you the government's position. But nor do we say that, lifestyles ought to be actively pushed, and nor should children be brought into the equation. So that's where we stand, but we also recognize that a majority of today's Singapore does not want Section 377A repealed. And so we have left it in the books. But otherwise, we have also said, if you are a homosexual, whether closet or public, you are protected as a Singapore citizen, whether you are straight or gay. And in fact, in the legislation that we have passed, Religious Harmony Act, it is an offense if religious groups are attacked by non-religious groups. Likewise, it's also an offense if religious groups attack, as in assault or threaten physically, say, gay groups or activist groups, for example. Everyone has their place. Live and let live. That's the approach we take. Second, and the important part of your question is family. What does this mean for family? The government recognizes that our society values a family structure, which is based on men and women marrying, and that is defined, and that's the definition of marriage in the Women's Charter. And the government subscribes to that principle. It doesn't mean that gays have no place in Singapore. They are entitled to their place in Singapore and place in the sun. It's just that it doesn't get defined as a marriage under the Women's Charter. That's a second point. And so the recognition of children as children of a lawfully wedded couple flows from the Women's Charter. But these social values and mores are under, I think, under stress. And in many, many countries, they have changed. And we are an island, but our internet penetration is more than 100%. Our children are all highly educated. Many of them are educated overseas. And the powerful forces that are shaping social thinking today come from Hollywood, the internet, Netflix, and a lot of literature. And society and society's social values and mores will be shaped by what people want. But in answer to your question, the Women's Charter defines what marriage is. That is the government's position, but we protect everybody, and we protect everybody's right to live and let live. And there have been specific cases where the courts have allowed adoption by single men who the children have been conceived through, artificial insemination overseas. Courts have allowed it, and we have given effect to the court rulings. So we recognize that, but we have also articulated a public policy. I cannot remember the precise date as to what our policy is on these matters.
Thank you, Minister. I think also related to this are some questions and concerns about what we hear about the cancel culture, and the being woke in terms of your attitude, and how sometimes Christians are seen as being very bigoted, especially on issues of gender and sexuality, and they find a need to apologize for their views in public and so on. I wonder if you have any comments on these trends that we see on social media and in our society today.
You see, in the physical world, we will not allow a group of people to come together and physically threaten or abuse somebody. That is an offense under our laws. But online, people come together, and if they attack you, harass you, that is potentially criminal. But at one level below, there is this cancel culture. I think we need to study this. There are various shades. People come together to say, look, we want to protect the earth. We think it is wrong of such and such a company to use this sort of energy. And, for example, palm oil, it's a clearing of a natural forest in order to grow palm oil, and the practices are very bad. And this is very wrong, and we would like a boycott of such products. And that's at one level. At the other level is, in this church, they don't accept single-sex marriage, or, they speak about this in their sermons. Let's cancel this pastor and this group and make them apologize and terrorize them. I think many people will feel uncomfortable about that kind of approach. So I think you are referring more to the latter. And I would say I am uncomfortable with the second, which is what you are talking about. I think we should have a framework where people have their views. They are entitled to express their views. And if they think that their religious views require them to express a point of view, I think they should be allowed to, as long as it's done in a civil way without denigrating someone else. If their views are spiky, if they say that, I don't accept this, I don't feel comfortable about this, and I'm informed by my religious beliefs, and I think, I would prefer that people behave in one manner or another. somebody else is entitled to rebut them, entitled to rebut and say, well, you may be informed by your religious views, but I'm informed by a different set of religious views, or I'm informed by no religious views, but I think this is wrong, and I think the position should be this, this, this. That's what discourse means. Unfortunately, we see a fair bit of that, but which is okay. But unfortunately, we also see people being attacked, not on the basis of the ideas, but on the basis of you dare to say this, and we're going to cancel you, or we're going to attack you. And I haven't analyzed whether it is the Christians who get more of it or the non-Christians, but I think there have been some high-profile cases where, yes, Christians who express such views have come under attack. And my personal view is that is unfortunate. And in society, we must make sure that everyone feels safe. Safe not to express derogatory views, safe not to express views which put down somebody else on the basis of their sexuality or race or religion, but safe to express their own views in a civil way. And I think it's a duty of the state to protect that sort of expression of views too.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, on the issue of secularism in Singapore, one of the participants would like to know, I guess this is maybe for historical reasons, why is there a Minister for Muslim Affairs, but not for the other religious faiths as well? Would you be able to shed some light on this?
Yes, a multiplicity of reasons. If you go back to 1959 when the PAP government took power, and 1965 when we became independent, or basically kicked out of Malaysia, the relationship between Malaysia and Singapore, what was the argument? The argument in Singapore was that when we were part of Malaysia, that Malaysia should be for Malaysians. It doesn't matter whether you are Malay, Indian, or Chinese. And the argument on the other side of the causeway is, no, first of all, we have racial-based parties, a party for the Chinese, party for the Malays, and a party for the Indians. And second, the supremacy of Malays to hold political power should not be challenged by any such concept of Malaysian Malaysia. And so the argument was very much a race-based argument. And so race was a key issue in the debate in those years. And when we became independent, it was important to assure our Malay community that, they're moving from, if we were part of Malaysia, they would be part of the majority. And they are moving to a situation where they are very much a minority, right? 15% of the population. In those days, I think 77% of the population was Chinese. It's now 74, 75%. Second, economically and socially, if you look at the mid-60s, the Malay community was not at the same level as the Chinese community. The Indian community was somewhere in between. The Chinese community, of course, economically was relatively successful, given that most people were not well off, and we were not a very rich place. We moved from third world to first world, but relatively the Chinese were better off. The professions, the businesses, public sector was dominated by Chinese, Singaporeans, but the Malays were much less represented than their population percentage would show. And there was a clear need to bring up the Malay community to be on par as much as possible. And we did it by saying there should be equality of opportunities, but extra help being given to the Malay community. And the religious needs for the Malay community was seen as something that the state needs to be taking care of. If you look at Christians, they're able to organize themselves, get the land and build churches. If you look at the Hindu community, they do the same. But the Malay community was socially and economically more disadvantaged. And I think it was fair that they are given a strong footing in Singapore, given the support, and government assures them that don't worry, you have your place in the sun and we'll look after you. So it's a combination of factors.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. Earlier on, you mentioned about Singapore's policy regarding hate speech and offensive speech in your brief address just now. I wonder if you are able to elaborate a little bit about how the government decides what constitutes either hate speech or offensive speech, or when is the line crossed. Is it normally done in consultation with the religious leaders if they are affected? How in practicality are the decisions made?
It's primarily objective, but sometimes it's a little bit of subjectiveness as well. We do consult religious leaders, but it cannot simply depend on religious leaders feeling offended. You know, it's got to cross certain thresholds. For a start, the lawyers come into the picture. You look at the words that have been uttered. Is it hate speech? Is it offensive speech? What is the likely impact? It's you look at the words. You look at the words in the context of our society. You look at and assess the likely impact. It also means whether a particular community is likely to be impacted by the words. And if you assess, well, this they are not likely to be impacted. They are not likely to take this seriously. That is a relevant factor. And I mentioned all of this in my speech in 2019 in Parliament on religious harmony. Bearing in mind, we draw the line quite tightly. And the context of the speech was, of course, the cancellation of the Watain concert. If you look at the Watain concert, I don't remember the full lines now, but it was on the face of it about killing Christians and, Christian God, I think being Satan, and a lot of derogatory language about Christians and how good it would be to shed Christian blood. And my ministry looked at it. We said this this doesn't look good. And then we did a counter check with how Christian leaders felt about it. Also, it's like a sounding board, an assessment when we made the decision. So you have white power music in US, as I said in my speech. What not a lot of people realize is that you also have Malay power music in Malaysia, where they talk about Hitler and what he did to the Jews, and why not the same thing to be done by the majority to the minority in Malaysia in songs. And songs are a very powerful medium to convey. Some people will say in the name of free speech, these are songs and you shouldn't take it too seriously. It's heavy metal. And, what impact does it have? People will just listen to it and laugh it off. We tend to take a slightly more cautious approach. So we look at the words, we look at whether they are offensive, whether they are likely to create and inflame tensions. That's hate speech. As I said to you, offensive speech is one level less. If you constantly denigrate, if we allow a comedy show that, say, allows Christians to be run down, or your archbishop is like this for the Catholics, and your bishop is like this, and we allow caricatures, cartoons, lampooning the religious leaders in Singapore or the parent churches overseas. Yeah, maybe the Christians may laugh it off, but after a time, I think the tone and texture of the discourse and discussion and attitude of the non-Christians to Christians can change. Whereas what we are looking for is live and let live. You don't want anything to do with the religion, fine, where nobody is forcing, but preferably one of respectful coexistence. I respect you, you respect me, you have your religion, I have mine, or I have no religion, doesn't matter. We all live without me denigrating you. That's in essence what we are trying to achieve.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, there are, I think from what I see of some of the questions, I think there's maybe some level of confusion on part of some of us as to what constitutes maybe crossing the line from religion into politics in an illegitimate way. So one particular participant asked about, for example, if a Christian pastor were to preach against abortion and maybe the country's laws on legalizing abortion and so on, would that constitute illegitimate crossing of boundaries? Would you please comment on that?
What I would suggest, the way to approach this is there will be aspects where religion, your religious beliefs may require you to, take a view on some policy, practice, and so on. When we had our debate on abortion, like early 70s or late 60s, I can't remember, the government recognized that this is a matter of conscience, people's personal belief systems. So the party whip was lifted and people were entitled to vote according to their conscience, members of parliament. Yeah. So that is that recognition. Abortion is an issue where everybody, it's a very personal viewpoint. Whereas on tax policies and government policies, the government doesn't, on most policies, most legislation, the government doesn't lift the whip. We are elected on a certain set of policies we have to implement. The party discipline means that MPs have to vote in accordance with the three-line whip. But certain cases we lift it, and abortion was one of those. Coming down to preachers, this is like, in a way, the best answer I can give, and you may not find it satisfactory, is it's like trying to describe the elephant. I think you know it when you see it. Essentially, how have we handled the religion and politics in Singapore in the relationship over the last 60 years? By good common sense on the part of the politicians and good common sense on the part of the religious leaders. When there are issues, and they have had, religious leaders have had views on a fair bit of legislation. What happens? They come to us, we sit down, we have a cup of coffee, we talk about it. The Prime Minister has chats on a periodical basis. I and my ministry meet religious leaders on a very regular basis. We also have the Presidential Council for Religious Harmony, where all the senior religious leaders are members, and we discuss issues. So we don't even wait for the issues to arise. We project forward. We talk about what we need to do. We talk about social issues. We talk about potential legislation that comes up, and the government takes into account what the religious leaders say. And if a pastor were to preach, talk about abortion and say that it is wrong, I think most people will recognize that he is speaking within his rights. But supposing you were to stand up in church and argue about, say, increasing or the necessity to impose higher taxes on people who are wealthier, I think most people will recognize that as a political cause. Now, some of these policies, which have stood us in good stead, were actually thought through by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So what should the pastor in that situation do? I think, you had conscientization in Latin America. And I think if you in Latin America in those days, and a vast bulk of people were poor, and you're fighting for Marxism, I don't know, maybe there can be some sympathy for it, where a small minority on top are oppressing a large majority. But it is really not for religious leaders to preach Marxism or socialism or capitalism. That should be left to the politicians. And Mr. Lee's perspective on this was as follows. I'm a political leader, as in, I hold a ministerial position. Mr. Lee explained it. He seeks to explain government policies. He seeks to win support from people on government policies. He explains it, people accept it, or they don't accept it. If they don't accept it, the government loses power, somebody else comes into power. Those are the rules of politics. Now, can Mr. Lee or any political leader ever compete on equal terms on a political debate with a religious leader? It is not possible, because when the religious leader speaks, he speaks with the authority of God. So on any political topic, right, any of the debates in parliament, if a senior religious leader comes, whether it's Muslim leader or a Christian leader or a Hindu leader, if he speaks, religious people will, it's not just the logic of it, it's who says it. If you say it with the authority of God, how can a mere mortal who is a minister or prime minister ever compete? To put it in simple terms, that's the point. So religious leaders who want to take part in politics, Mr. Lee's point is, you stop being a religious leader. If you have such strong views on politics, take off your religious robe, come into politics, either join an existing political party or form a new political party, compete for ideas on equal terms. And if I were to say something, and a senior bishop were to say something on the same issue in public, my appeal is always going to be less to the flock than that of the religious leader. So, and Mr. Lee had seen that in many countries, when you go down this path, religious leaders, not in Singapore, not always elsewhere, but in enough countries, and it's not necessarily Christianity, but other religions. You've seen it in Myanmar, you've seen it in Sri Lanka, you've seen it in many countries around this region. I rather not mention them, but religious leaders abuse their position actually for political power. That has happened, and the country then goes down the tube. So he wanted to keep religion and politics separate in that sense. You want to talk about politics, come and be a politician. Don't be a religious leader and take part in a political debate. But while we can put that across in that way, we must recognize and accept and respect the right of religious leaders to express their views on topics where religion is fundamentally an important point, as you talked about in abortion. So when the casinos were first mooted, the religious leaders, many religious leaders were uncomfortable, Christian as well as Muslim, and public statements were issued. But in Singapore, public statements are issued in a restrained way. You don't get actively into the arena. You issue it, you make it clear. And there were intense engagements with between the political leadership, government leadership, and religious leadership. And the result of which was a much more constructive approach, where a whole lot of safeguards were put in to help people who may not be able to afford to go into gambling, whose family background and whose families could suffer. So social safeguards, MSF coming in, working with the religious and community leaders and NGOs to help such families, a list of people who are excluded, a whole variety of safeguards so that we can achieve a common objective. So in these issues, it's always better to try and work across the aisle, as it were, but it requires common sense on the part of both the religious leaders and the political leadership, which we have had so far.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for recounting those experiences to us. Minister, there's also this question. I think it's quite general in nature. I think Christianity, like most religions, while it commands us to be loyal and good citizens of our country, to obey the authorities, enjoins our ultimate loyalty to God, or to a higher power, And as such, our loyalty to the state is always qualified by our higher loyalty to God. How does the government see this situation that we have a higher loyalty to God that's above the state? Would you be able to comment on that?
I don't see a conflict. The loyalty to God is personal. The loyalty to the state is as a citizen of the state. What does citizenship mean? I mean, the state is a conceptual entity. What is the state really? Your fellow human beings. We are in a country together. And in essence, what does it mean? You are living in Singapore, you are a Singapore citizen, you are surrounded by Singapore citizens and some who are non-Singaporeans. You benefit from that society. You get education, you get healthcare, you get housing. You also owe your obligations to fight and defend the country, which is really your fellow citizens. You have a duty to pay your taxes, and you have a duty to obey the laws. What are the laws there for? The laws are there to make sure that the safety and security of your fellow Singaporeans living in this community are protected. So it says, you shall not rape, you shall not steal, you shall not kill, you should not litter, and coming down to a more mundane example. But what is that for? It is so that other people can enjoy the same space and all of us can live together in a certain degree of safety and harmony. And I don't think you can say my personal belief system, my loyalty to God, requires me to go against these laws. Your fellow citizens who may not have such a belief may say, but then you are creating a problem for us by littering or doing whatever you want. And our enjoyment of the common space in a common citizenship is affected. So the state is a notional entity. In reality, it is a duty you owe to others in society to live peacefully and harmoniously in a way that helps you maximize your potential and helps you help everyone maximize their own potential. Now, your question, so I'll break it down in that way. How does your duty to God conflict with your duty to your fellow citizens, right? And if you really feel that you cannot live in a society, then you shouldn't ask for the advantages of living in a society and yet not follow the rules. But your question becomes, takes a different complexion. Let's say in a society that is failing, where the government is morally bankrupt and the laws are devastatingly bad, and it's sucking blood out of people. As you have seen in some cases in Latin America and some places in Asia, where people are dying, people are being shot by the forces. Then what is your duty as a person of religion? Even if you don't have religion, I think morality will say the very factors that require you to play your role as an active citizen, to be a part of the citizenry, will now require you to say, hey, all of our common security is being, if the troops are out on the street shooting us down for no reason, then you would say, and I'm not referring to any country, I'm giving you a hypothetical example, going back to the Marcos era, and the clerics came out on the streets in the people power revolution. I think even without religion, if I didn't have any religion, nevertheless, I think logic would dictate you are using your power to kill people. We are no longer living in safety and security. The laws are being abused, and it's my duty to resist. That is because the framework of the Constitution is no longer being obeyed. The government itself is acting illegally. Everything is breaking down. Now, that's different from another situation where the democratic process is working, where there is the Constitution, where there is a parliament, where there are elections, and you disagree with the law. Say you intensely disagree with the law, either for religious reasons or non-religious reasons. I do not like this law, and I think the government is extremely wrong in doing this. I want to change this law. I don't think you can use religion as a reason for disobeying the law or breaking the law just because you disagree. Nor can you, if you're non-religious, nor can you use your personal value system to say, I don't like this law. The law has been passed by a government in power in parliament in accordance with the rules. The government has been elected. Your duty then, if you really believe that the law is wrong, is to have it changed through democratic means. Form a political party, argue against the change, persuade people, win power, or persuade enough MPs to change the law. So you got to work within democratic norms. You may be influenced or informed by your religious views to do so, but you cannot use religion or your personal belief system or if you're an atheist, your system of values to say, I will not obey. When there's a functioning democracy and a way of, a legal way of doing things. So this is how I will separate it.
Thank you very much, Minister.